Now we look at how effective the Liberal reforms were. Watch the following clip, then pause the tape and make notes of the limits on the Liberal reforms. How many people actually benefited, and to what extent?
Did the Liberal reforms create a welfare state? Medical inspections for children were put in place, but there was no free health service for them. Most people were entitled to a pension, but the amount they received was below that needed for a minimum standard of living. Health insurance was introduced, but it only covered wage earners, not their families. Unemployment insurance was introduced, but it didn't cover the bulk of the working population. So you could say that in these areas of social welfare, the Liberal reforms had left major gaps to be plugged. But what was firmly established by the Liberal reforms was the principle of the state having a responsibility for the welfare of its people. Without this principle having been accepted, no welfare state could have developed. Whether this is enough to give Lloyd George the title of Father of the Welfare State is open to question.
How did you do? You might have noted that most people weren't covered by national insurance. In fact, only about 2 million people were covered, and the payments didn't last very long. You should also know that the poor law and the workhouse were not abolished, and most medical treatment wasn't covered. The Liberals didn't intend to tackle the whole problem of poverty and sickness. They only wanted to provide a safety net to deal with the most serious difficulties. Most workers weren't covered, and the families of workers weren't covered at all. Payments ended after a fixed number of weeks and were very low, much lower than the figures worked out by Booth and Rowntree. When the payments stopped, the worker and his family would have to apply to the poor law for help. Workhouses weren't abolished until 1929. Most medical treatment wasn't covered. The only illness that was treated free of charge in hospitals was TB, and that was because it was so serious. Nevertheless, the Liberal reforms were a great step forward and were very popular with working people at the time. So don't fall into the trap of criticising the reforms because they didn't create a welfare state. Here's a typical question you might get on this topic. How did the Liberals change the ways that poverty and ill health were tackled in Britain in the years from 1906 to 1914? OK, let's work through it. The question is asking you to explain how things changed. So to get good marks, you must show the differences that the Liberal reforms made and not just describe the reforms. Remember, first note down your main points and then spend about 15 minutes writing an answer to the question. Now stop, rewind the tape and have another look at this whole section. Then have a go. So your plan for your answer should look something like this. Children, the elderly, low paid, sick, unemployed. But remember when you write your full answer to include details of what didn't change as well. Don't forget that the poor law and the workhouses were still in existence. That's the end of the whole section on the Liberal reforms.